You ever wonder what it will take to really end racism? Well, I'd like to share with you a little bit of my experience with that question by doing three things. Talking about what racism is, as I've come to understand it, what can actually be done about it, and why I think it matters for everyone. So first to definitions. When I was a kid, I thought racism was principally about being called the N-word, or being underestimated, or having a contest rigged so that I didn't get the prize that I actually had won on the basis of my performance. But I've come to learn that it is so much more than that. It is an entire system of advantages and disadvantages based on race. And it was created to justify a hierarchy, political, economic, social, on this false idea that white people are at the top and everybody else is at the bottom, kind of on a ladder. It has both external dimensions that you can see out there in the world and internal dimensions that are inside of all of our hearts and minds. And so I'm going to talk a little about some of those external things, and then we'll talk about the internal and how they play off of each other. So you can see racism sometimes in the single decisions of an individual. Like research shows that a hiring manager is more likely to call in for an interview someone whose name is John than Juan or Jamal or Bin, even if the resume is exactly the same, just the name at the top is different. Sometimes it shows up in the way companies make decisions, like putting unhealthy, inferior, or toxic processes or products in Black and Latino neighborhoods, which happens way more still than you'd like to imagine. It shows up in incredible gaps in outcomes, like things like the persistent infant mortality rate being higher for kids of color, even when the parents have the same access to healthcare, education, financial resources. There are still these gaps in outcomes. And you can see it in the consequences of sweeping acts of public policy. Take, for instance, the taking of Native American lands and then re-granting to white settlers and to homesteaders. Take the pouring of $120 billion of federally backed home loans into suburbs after World War II that were, by definition, exclusively white. And the gap in wealth that just those two things created has spanned generations, and it will take us a very long time to catch up. So when you ask yourself, why are some neighborhoods poor and some neighborhoods rich, there are actually decisions, public policy, investments that have built that inequality. And so it's not about a given person's individual activity or motivation or skill. There's a whole system behind what we see as those outcomes. So that's the external. Now, on the inside, there are all kinds of stereotypes that we are swimming in and come out of us in the way we tell ourselves who's beautiful and who's smart and who's scary and what it takes to get ahead and what it means when people don't. Think of how you answer that question. And it also lives inside of us in terms of unconscious bias. And I want to give you a little dip into the science of unconscious bias to see what I mean by that. So if you wouldn't mind to read out the color of each line of text as quickly as you can. You shout it out. All right, one more. And one more. Yeah, that one was a little trickier. And here's why. Because our brains needed to take an extra split second to bypass the connections between the color of the letters and the meaning of the words. We have those unconscious connections between dirt and brown and sunshine and yellow and so forth. This slide messes with that. And unconscious bias works exactly the same way. Those stereotypes I was mentioning, they provide the unconscious kind of operating system that helps us make sense of the world around us. And our conscious thoughts and our conscious behavior get driven by those unconscious processes. And you can see this. I'm going to tell you a story about my husband. See how those unconscious things then manifest themselves in more conscious aspects of racism. So Anthony is a dark-skinned African-American man, and he lived in Georgetown in D.C. in the 90s when there were not very many black residents. His neighbor's kids had a very loud party one night, and he and his roommates went out to see what was happening. Somebody called the police. When the officers came, she asked each of his roommates, who were both white, who are you, why are you out here? And each of them said, I live over there. And she said, okay, and moved on. When she got to Anthony, he gave the same answer, I live over there. And she said, I need to see a key. And then he produced the key. She said, put it in the lock, open that door. So he did. Now, his roommates had never seen anything like this. They were furious, they were shocked, they wanted to call the write an op-ed and all that. He was angry, but not surprised, because that kind of profiling was a fact of his life, and it is a fact of life for people of color. Day in and day out, it still goes on. Whether it is a teacher deciding whether to send a kid to the principal or not, whether it is a social worker deciding whether to remove a child from their family or to serve a family intact, whether it is a judge deciding whether to give probation or a sentence of incarceration. The unconscious processing about who you can trust, who's likely to do the right thing, it drives the conscious decision-making, and it drives unequal results. And that's where the unconscious and the external stuff kind of play off of each other. I will tell you that as a parent of 3 black sons, I and many other parents of color this summer in particular have had to tell them, again, a story we tell way too much. We have to tell our kids that on the one hand, if you work hard, you will get ahead, and you've got to work hard and apply yourself. And on the other hand, you have to tell them that life is really stacked against you in a certain kind of way. And if you're a boy of color, if you're a young man of color, you could be perceived as a threat, and that kind of perception of you as threat could mean your life. It could mean your life. If somebody mistakenly thinks you are a dangerous person, it could mean your life. As a parent, it is a heartbreaking thing to have to tell your kid that, and to know that it is real. It happens. Now, that is the bad news, and there's a lot of bad news to be sure. The good news is that while unconscious bias is wired into our neural processing, it is not permanent. And if we surround ourselves with relationships with people, with understandings of history, with different kinds of images, we can shift that neural processing. We can shift, in a way, the operating system that becomes the background for our conscious choices and our conscious actions, and we can make a difference. And we've got to take on that internal work and the external work at the same time. And there's more good news there. My colleagues and I have come to a bit of a formula that we've seen work. When you take networks of people who build the will, the skill, the knowledge, and the strategies together to eliminate racism, they can actually make progress. So a few quick stories about some of those elements. On the network side, we worked with a group in a northeastern state. They wanted to see every kid get to kindergarten healthy and ready to learn. They've done great work with individual families over the years, but there are gaps that remained. And they decided, we're going to bring together a completely different collection of people, parents and educators and business people and researchers and early childhood educators and more, to take on together the responsibility for equity, about making sure the outcomes actually work for all kids, even though it would take different things for different kids to get there. And that commitment to equity became the glue, so that now these organizations who used to work right in their own boundaries of their discipline are now crossing those institutional boundaries to make it easier for people, families, to get access to what they need so that they can achieve their dreams for themselves and for their kids. Sometimes working against racism can be tough. I can imagine you might think that. And the will itself has to be built. We were working with a group of juvenile justice officials who were learning how racism works in their field and what they could do about it. And one of the participants wasn't so enthusiastic until it got personal. I had asked them, could you please share your racial identity and a story about that? And when it got to Joe, he said, I'm Italian American. And I said, excellent. Now tell us how you identify racially. And he looked at me like a deer in a headlight. And eventually he said white. He told me later that it was probably in his mid-40s, had never thought of himself as white until that moment. But once he understood that there was this system of advantage that he benefited from, without his active consent or desire or anything, and once he started to see how racism operates very practically in his area of work and what he could do about it, he is on fire, and he will never be the same. Sometimes you need a little skill. You might have the desire, but when I was starting to learn about this stuff, I was frankly insufferable. I saw things in black and white. There were right answers, there were wrong answers, and it was my job to tell you the error of your ways. After years of this kind of debate and convince, I met the Interaction Institute for Social Change, where I now work. And I learned that there are incredible ways to skillfully bring work forward in a collaborative setting. Where I used to slice and dice and argue and interrupt, now I am offering ideas for consideration. I listen to people and ask deep questions. I facilitate dialogue and I teach other people to do the same. It's an incredible gift when you're working on issues as tough as racism to be able to help make it easy for people to think together and decide together and move forward together. It takes a little skill. And it also takes a little knowledge connected to strategy. We've been working with a group that's doing economic opportunity, sort of expanding economic opportunity. They've been bridging young people over the barriers to economic success one by one by one. And as they learned how racism operates, they came to see that they had to do more than that. They're still bridging one by one, but they're also joining with others to help remove those barriers so that one day there won't be a need for their program, or many of them are like that everyone will have the opportunities they need to succeed. So we talked about how networks that have the will, the skill, the knowledge, and the strategy can actually make progress on ending racism, but you might wonder why this matters. And here's what I think. Ending racism is going to free up resources, psychic resources, financial resources, other kinds of resources that we really need to have healthy, vibrant, resilient communities. It's going to make it possible for millions of people who right now can't participate fully to contribute to the wealth of our communities, to the health of our communities. It's going to deepen our empathy and connectedness and help us to build communities that are based in mutual respect and bound together by our shared humanity, even as they are strengthened by our differences. Ending racism is a big job with an even bigger payoff. And we come behind generations who have worked at this, and I believe it is our turn to keep moving that work forward. With the will, the skill, the knowledge, and the strategies, I believe we can get there together. Thank you.